the Gateway to College National Network, and I am joined by Manager of Research and Reporting, Devorah Shama, who is going to present on the information that we came here to see. So thanks for joining us for the discussion on who are they and how they get here, and we will be focusing on student typologies. This was a peer learning conference discussion, and while we won't go into as much detail that we might be able to during a discussion, we hope to generate some good thinking here about how we can support our students. And without further ado, welcome, Devorah.
Hello, everybody. So we're going to start today by just looking at a little bit of the research that's been done on high school dropouts, and then we're going to get to the more interesting part of looking at actual Gateway to College student data. And then, as Prentice said, we are hoping to generate a little bit of a discussion as best we can with this format to talk about how this information is useful to support our students.
And when we say discussion, we mean discussion in a text-based sense.
Okay, so this chart that you're looking at here just gives you a brief snapshot of some of the research that's been done over the last 10 years. Up until about 15 years ago, people really thought of high school dropouts as a homogeneous group. And as all of us who have worked with high school dropouts well know, students drop out of high school for a variety of reasons, and they certainly are not identical to each other. So here, just to give us a little sense of how that research has been going, Janois in 2000 is research that's cited quite a lot. You'll see that reference. And he looked at a Canadian sample, used a statistical technique called clustering, and came up with these 4 groups. Low achievers, the students who were really having academic issues, maladjusted students, you can see the influence of the British English there, of students who really had a lot of behavioral issues, disengaged students, students who might be doing okay academically but were really pretty bored with school and were not engaging, probably not attending regularly, and quiet, which he described as students who were doing okay and just kind of disappeared off the radar. Students who teachers would be really surprised they had dropped out until they realized they hadn't been coming for a while. We see Fortin et al. Also up in Canada actually looked at a sample of students coming from risky environments and came up with some pretty similar groups. Also found 4 groups: an academic, challenged group, a group that was challenged more with socially adjusting to school. You can tell that he's a psychologist in the antisocial covert behavior group, and students who were just uninterested in school. Balfant is probably the 4 groups that most of you are the most familiar with. He synthesized a lot of research and came up with these 4 names to describe dropout: students who are failing to succeed, push out, being students that schools might not be so eager to serve and might have helped out, generally students that have had a lot of expulsions and behavioral issues who might be challenging their teachers, those types. Students with life events, meaning students who really dropped out because of things that were happening outside of the school context, and fade out, much like the quiet, just students who slowly fell off the radar. Lessard, who is actually a student of Fortin, I included here just because his titles of the groups are really interesting. He actually did a purely qualitative study. So those names for the 4 groups that he found are based on interviews. So talking about students who really were never even in the game of school, students who really just don't get how school works. Again, your students who have behavioral issues, your disengaged students, and then those quiet on the other end. Mensner and Hampel is a really interesting study. That study just looked at seniors in high school. So we're talking just 12th graders. And he found 3 groups. Your group of students who were really struggling with school and recognized that. These groups that he called lackadaisical, which were really students who just aren't really motivated about school, not so worried about graduating, they're just kind of along for the ride. And then his group that I find most interesting found a surprised group and an overwhelmed group. The overwhelmed group are students who were just overwhelmed by things going on in their lives and school. But the surprised group, which is a group I think we definitely see in Gateway, are students who were trucking along in their senior year and didn't realize until really late in the year that they didn't have enough credits to graduate. And were really surprised when they were told they were not going to walk across that graduation stage.
I have a question about the Minzer and Hampel study. You said that they specifically looked at high school seniors. I wonder, just from your perspective, if there's any drawbacks or benefits for just focusing on a singular group.
It's a great question. It's a smaller group. As we all know, students are dropping out as early, probably as 6th grade. So this study, of course, misses students who dropped out at middle school, that larger group of students that probably dropped out in the middle school to 9th grade transition. But it is an interesting group to look at because the surprised group we wouldn't see in a larger sample. So really seeing that, even students who've made it all the way to that senior year benchmark, they're not necessarily home free just because they got to fall of senior year.
Okay, thanks.
And then our final study that we're looking at here is Bowers, who did a really recent study. He's based in Texas, and he used a statistical method called latent class analysis that we're going to talk about a little bit because that's what we duplicated for our study. This method really tests whether the groups that you find are statistically different from each other. And he came up with 4 groups, or 3 groups, excuse me. He's got his quiets, which included both these groups from other researchers of students who were struggling academically and the students who kind of faded out and surprised teachers when they left. He has a group that he's called Jaded, who are the students who really are having a negative experience in school. So that certainly includes the students with a lot of behavioral difficulties, expulsion, students who also just didn't respect their teachers, didn't feel like they were getting good teaching. And then his contribution was this involved group, which is a group that's really interesting to think about. These are students who weren't doing great in school academically, but they were really engaged in school, especially in extracurricular activities. So think about your football players, your students that are in the drama club. And in many ways, those activities may have been what was holding on to them. But at some point, they started having enough behavioral issues that they either dropped out on their own or may have been pushed out of school. All right, so we're going to move on here. So latent class analysis, which you do not need to know a whole lot about, except to know that this is a statistical test that looks at unobserved subgroups using observed variables. So what that means is using things that we can measure, like a student reports on their perceptions of their school experience or their age, their grade, things like that. The computer is essentially looking for hidden patterns among the participants. And we use this method because we really wanted to look and see whether the students who are coming to Gateway, which is a unique group because we're looking at students who have dropped out or who are on their way to drop out, but all of our students have re-engaged in school because they've come to us at Gateway. And we wanted to see what kind of subgroups we had within our population. So just briefly, this is essentially the study that Bowers did, and we use this as a model. He looked at the educational longitudinal survey data, and within that data, he had almost 1,500 students who had reported dropping out at least once, and he had access to some really good school data like number of expulsions expulsions and suspensions, their GPA, their credits. He also had some survey data on student perceptions about the school environment, how safe school was, the type of teaching, and their attendance, and extracurricular activities and things like that. He did his analysis, tested 1 through 5 groups, and came up with those 3 groups that we just talked about, the jaded, quiet, and the proud. So here at Gateway, we have a data set of a little over 5,000 students, which includes the data that you guys have faithfully put in the database.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And here we're really looking at students at entry. So we were looking at those variables that you include, like their GPA at entry, how many credits they have. We did also use some demographic information in here. And then we linked that to new student surveys. So this just includes students who gave us permission to make that link and provided either a name or college student ID to allow us to match that information. And from the new student survey, to approximate some of the information that Bowers had, we used those scales about barriers. We looked at whether students were working because we thought that would be important, and also their first generation status. And we tested 2, 3, 4, and 5 groups. You can see I made a pretty strong assumption there that we did not have just one group of students. And we really landed on 4 groups that make sense both statistically and hopefully meaningfully. And now we're going to look at who those groups are.
And you mentioned that you sort of stayed away from assigning a label to each of these groups. So you want to maybe say a few words about why you took that approach?
So at this point, as you can see, we're calling these groups 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we're doing that really intentionally. We wanted to get feedback from all of you and also to dig into each of these groups a little deeper and really figure out how they lay on those groups that other researchers have found. Again, recognizing that our group of dropouts really is a subset of dropouts. These are dropouts who's re-engaged in school, and while it may be that we draw students from across that entire span of students who drop out, we may actually have a subset of students. There may be a particular type of student that we would never see because they have dropped out and they're just not going to re-engage. Mm-hmm. And of course, we're doing this at this point strictly from the quantitative data. We haven't been able to really dig in and talk to students and get more deeper understanding of who students are and why they're perceiving things the way they do. So one of the most important things when we look at these groups is to figure out how they're distributed across the network. So you'll see a pie chart there that our groups are not even. So we have 4 different groups, but 41% of the students nationally that were in this group are in this data set are in group 1. So that's a huge group of students for us, followed by group 2, which is almost a third. And then we've got the smaller group 3, 20%, so that's about 1 out of every 5 of our students, and a very small, just over 10% group 4. And I should mention here, the way a latent class analysis works, this is a whole bunch of probabilities. So once it figures out the groups, it looks at every student, looks at how they answered the question, and takes a best guess at which group the student would be in. So this information is not designed to help us look at an individual student and go, okay, I'm going to figure out if you're a 1, 2, 3, or 4. Because they may blur, and they may have some attributes from group 1 and group 3. But the idea is for us to holistically look at our student population and be able to say, oh, if 40% of our students look this way, then let's really make sure we've got some interventions in here that are going to work for them.
Mm-hmm. But I like what you said about, you know, not looking at your students deeply in the eyes and going, are you a 1, 2, 3, or 4? Because I think, you know, sort of putting them in too tight of a box, you might miss out on some other cues that don't nicely align with how they've been assigned to a particular group.
Exactly. And you can think of this in a similar way that you would think of the multiple intelligences. We know that students may have a strength in one intelligence, but they'll still have attributes of a couple of others. And that's much more what this type of analysis does. So it's not about putting them in a box. Some students, you know, in terms of when the computer was assigning them, they had a 90% chance of being in group 1. That's pretty solid. But some of them might have had a 60% chance of being in group 1 and a 20% chance of being in 2 and a 20% chance of being in 4. The computer would have said, okay, that 60 is the biggest, I'm putting them in group 1. But you can see that student crosses over some boundaries.
And I'm going to remind the participants out there, if you, again, have questions, please feel free to use the chat panel, which is on the tab on the right side of your computer screen. Okay.
All right, let's dig in. Okay, so really quickly, this is the list of variables or pieces of information that we used for this analysis. And I should mention, we did control for gender and ethnicity, so that basically we told the computer to ignore that when it was sorting the groups. So we have a pretty even distribution across all 4 groups of male and female, and the way students identify their ethnicity.
It would be interesting someday to take a look at that, though.
Yes, it would. And you can see those 5 variables at the top: age, high school credits, GPA, math, and language. Those are, again, those pieces of information that you guys gave us from the database. So that is information that came from a variety of sources, like their transcripts and their applications. The rest of the variables on here are self-reports from the student. So we're really looking at how a student perceives the world, not necessarily how we would perceive that student's life. Okay, so we're going to move through each of the groups here, and then I will have a slide that puts them all side by side so you can compare them.
And I'll just put in a plug for the importance of data management by program, starting with the student application information and the new student survey information. Because without those efforts, we wouldn't be able to compile this information and share this with you. So.
All right, so we're going to look at each group in order from the largest group down to the smallest group. So we're starting with group 1, which again was 41%. You can see 3 of these lines are green, or at least they're green on our screen. Academic problems, infrequent attendance, and first generation. Those are things that were common to our students across all 4 groups. I don't think that'll surprise anybody listening here. The majority of our students are likely to talk about academic problems being one of the barriers they had while they were in high school. They are likely to say the same about attendance. And I think our most recent count is just under 80% of our students are first-generation college goers. So this group, the lines that are in pink are the things that really distinguish this particular group. So this group was really likely to tell us that they had had problems with their peers, that nobody cared about them when they were in school, and had problems with school administration and teachers. They also report problems with their family or household. So in looking at this and talking about it around our office, a lot of us have really noticed that this is a lot of relationship issues. And relationship issues not just at school, but also at home. You'll also notice the average age for these students is 16.9, so they're on the younger side for these groups. And they're coming in at just under the average GPA of Gateway students at 1.46.
And, you know, I would ask the participants to be thinking about, you know, as you hear this information, I'm sure that it's easy to think of representative examples of students who you know might, quote unquote, fit the bill with some of these examples.
Okay, so this is our second group, and in a lot of ways this is the group that has really caught my interest. They are a little older than our first group. They're just over 17 in general. They have a higher GPA, 1.57. They're coming in above the average Gateway GPA. And you'll notice these students really only endorse those 3 lines that are really common to all the groups. So these are students who do not perceive particular issues or particular things that are on our list anyway in the new student survey as being what was their barrier in school. These students obviously had barriers in school. We wouldn't have them otherwise. They were behind in credit. They weren't doing well in their classes, but they're not able to identify whether it was issues with their teachers, whether there were stuff going on at home. And we have a lot of theories about this group around the office. We'll be interested in hearing some of yours. You know, we wonder if these are students who don't recognize problems because there are so many problems in their life it almost becomes blind to them. I also wonder if these are students who have a really strong belief that it's up to them, that they're accountable, they should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. If they weren't successful, it's because they didn't study hard enough or they didn't do their chores the way they were supposed to.
Yeah, you know, I'm interested in this group too. It seems like in some instances you have the more resilient type of student, and they actually have as many problems as many of the other students, but when you talk to them, they won't readily admit, hey, my world is falling apart. They almost have a different perspective of things that are within their control and don't readily admit defeat, if you will. Some are maybe a little prideful, but also have a can-do attitude and a resilience about them that makes them a little bit hesitant to sort of lay all their problems out, as if to say that, hey, I'm being defeated by all these things. It's very interesting.
All right, so group 3, so this is only 20%, about 1 in 5 of our students nationally. This is our oldest group, almost 18 on average. They also have our highest GPA. They're coming in at 1.84, so just under a C average, and much higher than the network average. Their issues, as you can see in blue on here, are problems with family and household and too many family responsibilities. We also see, it's not highlighted because it was under a 50%, but about 42% of them said that they were working. And I did dig into this group a little bit deeper because one of the first questions was, is this where our parents are? And yes, for the most part, this is where students who are parenting, especially students who have their children living with them are, which would not be a surprise. These students may also be the students who are really contributing to their household economically or doing some caretaking, either for siblings or parents or grandparents.
In terms of the percentage of students having jobs, do you know if group 3 is higher than the other groups?
It's not the highest, but it's close.
Okay. But there's clearly an emphasis on a lot of family responsibilities, which oftentimes is work, and sometimes those responsibilities are at odds with the goals of doing what it takes to becoming a successful college student.
Absolutely, and we see that too in these green areas, which again are issues for all of our groups, but their academic problems is a little lower than their attendance. They're really likely, 84% of them are identifying attendance as an issue, and as we know, that would go hand in hand with having a lot of responsibilities at home. So it seems that for this group, the issues that they're struggling with to be successful in school aren't about school itself, but are about managing school on top of whatever's happening in their other contexts.
And you know, across some immigrant cultures, in some instances you'll see where the ability to contribute to the household resources is a value that's placed above needing to get an education, because the benefits of getting an education now is down the road, where the light bill was due last week.
Absolutely.
And so it would be interesting to see an ethnic breakdown to see if, and that might hint at some validity towards that theory.
Right.
But
right.
yeah, definitely appears to be some elements of this going hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. And then our last group, which again is just over 10%, 12% of our students. As you can see, are students who have issues or are perceived issues across the board. These are our students that are reporting issues with drug and alcohol. They're, tremendous amount of issues. 98% of them reported problems with family or household. They're having problems with the legal system. They also had problems with peers at school, felt that nobody cared, problems with school administration. So these students have problems and barriers to being successful in school all over the place. In school, out of school, at home, with their peers, with their families. And again, this is all student report, so these problems, may in a more objectified realm be really real or not. Part of this may be students who just really need kind of that growth mindset, who are taking everything really personally and escalating it.
Mm-hmm.
But these also could be students, we certainly all know students who really truly had multiple issues and barriers happening across the board. Their family may be homeless, there may be drug and alcohol issues at home, they may be responsible for taking care of siblings, and constantly having things thrown at them that got in the way of being successful in school. And of course that multiplied into having problems at school. This is actually the group that reports having a job most, 68%. They also are not managing their job that well, because 55% of them report that there's conflict between school and work. So these are students who are really struggling. I suspect these are the students who are in our offices the most. I suspect these are also the students who pull at our heartstrings the most. And I suspect they monopolize our time, which may be problematic since they are 10% of our students, and we need to make sure that while we're addressing the needs of students in this group, that we're not neglecting the needs of our students who are groups 1 and 2, especially that group 2, which was the group that isn't reporting a lot of barriers or issues.
Yeah, this is, just looking at this slide, the thing that stands out to me is, if this was a scoreboard, this thing is really lit up.
Yes, exactly.
Compared to the other slides that we've shown, there's some spots here or there, but this one is really, it's filled out the board completely. And, that being representative of what our students are telling us about some of the challenges they're facing, they really are coming to the program, or they're at least expressing a lot of they're expressing a lot of challenges during their time in the program. And as you said, likely to pull at our heartstrings. And, a lot of why we're in this work is so that we can have a positive impact on the lives of others. And, a student in group 4 might be the poster child for that idea. But you're right. I think an interesting challenge is that while these students only make up 12% of our student types, you can see that based on all the challenges that they report, take up a fair share of resource specialists and staff time. And it's almost like that squeaky wheel analogy. Again, if we're comparing the students here to the students in the second group who really were the ones who didn't really identify a bunch of barriers, but yet they made up about 27% of the student types. Those might be the more quiet ones too. When they drop off the face of the map, you never hear from them, and you're wondering, like, hey, what happened? meanwhile, there's a lot of time being spent on a small number of a small percentage, I should say, of students who have tremendous challenges. I also wonder, thinking about the adolescent brain development, how much of this is the student who perceives the world is crashing down on me as I speak, and nothing seems to work right, and everybody's out to get me, and those types of things. But those too are the students who require a lot of staff time.
Yes, I think that's both. And the other thing to notice too is this is probably the student that the average person on the street thinks of as a dropout. Mm-hmm. They really think of dropouts as students without a lot of potential and students who need a lot of effort and who haven't been successful. And again, this is a smaller percentage, so this also could help us get that message out that, for a lot of high school dropouts, it's a smaller set of barriers that they just need a little help to overcome to be able to reach that high school diploma and move forward with their education. Mm-hmm. All right, so we're going to take a quick look. This is all the information that we've just talked about, but all together on one slide so we can make some comparisons. Are there any questions at this point about the groups themselves before we talk a little bit about how to best use this information?
I'm sure there are questions out there about these student types. So again, just use the chat function to type in your questions about anything that we've discussed so far or some of the data that you're looking at. Or maybe there's a comment. Maybe you have a comment that says, you know what I'm really noticing about a lot of the students we serve, they are mostly like that group or this group. So, Devorah, is there anything that stands out to you looking at all of these side by side?
I think, again, we really get a reiteration of Group 2 and how few of them endorse these issues. You can see that their numbers in white are significantly lower than the numbers of any of the groups. And each of these numbers is the probability that students said yes to that question, essentially, within each group. I also noticed that Group 4 is the group that has faced a lot of homelessness, that has faced trouble with the legal system. So students who really are dealing with a lot of barriers that may be beyond the capacity of Gateway alone to serve, students who really need to be hooked into a broader safety net within our communities.
Yeah, and that gets back to the idea of wraparound support, which is at the core of Gateway to College. And again, that wraparound support doesn't mean that all of those services stem from the program itself, nor is it possible. It's really a matter of combining what the program can do with the resources that are in the community for organizations who are designed to assist students in certain ways. So we have one question from Herman, who is out of the National Network Office. And his question to you, Devorah, is, have you run an analysis which attaches course outcomes to these groups? That's an awesome question. Thank you. Thank you, Herman.
You'd think I planted him there, because that's going to move us right into the rest of our discussion. That is the first analysis I did once we established these groups. And interestingly, we are not serving any particular group better than the others. So we're not seeing that one of these groups is more successful in either courses or graduating or retention for the most part. We're going to talk about that in a little bit.
Not even Group 4.
Not
with all that stuff going on.
Not even group 4. So on the one hand, that says we're doing similar services for all of these groups. On the other hand, that we could look at that and be concerned about that, because really, if the majority of our students are in group 1 and 2, we would like to see our program really doing stellar things for those 2 groups and see them, you know, just naturally kind of being ahead of the pack in terms of successful outcomes. So with that question, let's move on. So this is just a quick reminder again of the distribution of these groups.
And roughly, I'll just say group 1, again, were those students who typically had problems with relationships, and those relationships were with peers and adults. That second group, the green bar there, were the students who said, I can't identify very many problems. And then the third group really dealing with some parenting challenges and some problems in the home. And then the fourth group really just has some issues, pretty much they're struggling all the way around. And so they, again, would be the student that presents a multitude of challenges. They have the highest homelessness. They also report working the most and things like that. We have another question. And Angela from Essex comments that she finds it interesting that bullying is not listed as a contributing factor of Gateway students dropping out. That is a really good point.
We do ask a question about school safety on the new student survey, which is probably the closest one that would get at bullying issues. And actually not enough students endorse that across the network for us to have been able to include it in this analysis. But you're absolutely right, and we may need to call that out a little more clearly to get student perception.
Yeah, you would wonder, you know. I think there's some proxies for that we hear from students sometimes. Not fitting into groups often means that you're being ridiculed in some sort of way, maybe even picked on.
And we certainly don't, because the safety question and the getting along with peers probably work as proxies for students who were bullied. We certainly don't get at students who were doing the bullying. And there's certainly research that shows that those students have some equal struggles and risk factors that we should be paying attention to.
Good point. Keep those comments and questions coming.
All right. So on our next slide, what we're looking at here is just a handful of data from some of our programs across the network. To basically look at this idea in that bottom corner, the kind of orangey graph is again that picture of the way the Gateway national network, the groups are distributed. But you can see if you glance across here, for some of our programs, they have a really different distribution of the groups. So we've got a program that has almost 60% in group 1 and pretty even distributions of the other 3 groups.
And which one is that? Oh, this one here. Right here. This group right here.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. And then we've got another group actually right next to it, these 2 schools here that have pretty even distribution. So that's going to be a different challenge when you're looking at your student population, that they're really coming from all 4 of these groups with some different profiles. And then we have some other groups that really mimic the national network. This one here. And then we also, and we have a couple of groups where that group 4 is bigger. So it's coming close to 20% in both of these schools. So while nationally we don't see a lot of group 4, it may be the case that in a particular program we are seeing more group 4s, and that would have to do with how students are being referred and school districts and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so let's pause there for a second. So say a little bit more about that. Are you suggesting that maybe in some instances it's, hey, the student is not making it here, they're struggling, let's send them the gateway, that type of thing?
I think a combination of that, and also just how proactive a school district is in referring a student over, because those students who are expressing barriers across are probably the hardest to re-engage in some ways. And also, just to head off the question that is probably coming, yes, each of you absolutely can get a hold of what the data looks like for your specific school. Go ahead and email me, and we'll make sure you can get to me, or you can email Prentice and he'll forward it along to me. We haven't just sent these out to every school, because for some schools we don't have enough students who allowed us to match their information on the new student survey for the information to be useful. But if you send me an email, I will certainly tell you what we know about your program. All right, let's go on. So this was the one outcome, going back to Herman's question, where we saw a little bit of difference across our group. So this is looking at trends in fall-to-fall persistence. And you can see for groups 1, 2, and 3, it stayed relatively flat. We've got a few peaks and valleys, but it's roughly the same. We've got group 3 creeping up towards 60%, so doing a little better. Groups 1 and 2 kind of hovering between that 50-55% mark. In group 4, we can see we've really gotten better over the last 3 years observing them. We've moved their fall-to-fall persistence from 32% to 49%, bringing them closer to the statewide average, which is awesome and wonderful. But again, we want to look at, that's 12% of our students. So what would happen to our persistence numbers if we can make the same sort of gains with group 1, which is 40% of the network, or a combination of groups 1 and 2. And again, we're not trying to say we want to ignore a certain group, but we also want to make sure that a particular group isn't hogging all of our attention and resources, and that a group like group 2 that's probably less vocal about what they need is falling off our radar.
Yeah, and I'm seeing some virtual head nods out there. And everybody, I've been on calls with directors where some group 4 students were at the door with essentially the challenge of the day, and not really to minimize the importance of addressing all students' needs, but this is really, hopefully this can really help the folks on the call, particularly those who are connected with how students are served, to take a step back and assess, just how your time is distributed. Are you, and ask yourself, are you spending an inordinate amount of time with only a few students because they come to you with so many challenges? And what are some ways that your support can be more evenly distributed? Again, because we might have, again, students in group 2 who are a little more quiet and not going to raise any red flags, but then all of a sudden you're looking around saying, hey, what happened to her? And she's not around anymore. So just some food for thought. All right. So that was a lot of statistical information compiled by information from around the network that can be an advantage to programs and help them be more mindful about how students are served. And so based on that information, what questions do you have for us? And if if you don't have questions for us, I definitely have a question for you, and that question is, again, based on everything that we've heard, what are some considerations for better serving students based on the Gateway to College student types? What might you be thinking about doing differently as a result of hearing some of this information? Angela, what do you think? What about Eugenia? What are your thoughts? Oh, sorry, Eugenia. Thanks for the text message, but or the chat message, but nothing came through. All right, let's try this again. Yeah, so Eugenia, you know, she's like me. She's a reflective type, and mentioned that there is a lot of interesting information, and just need more time to take it all in. Thank you. Okay, so just, you know, one of the things is, again, thinking about the student types. Also be thinking about, you know, what types of interventions might be most needed by either one of those groups of students. And I thought I would just show this, but this is not to say that you're not well aware of all these types of services to provide students. It's really just bringing back to your attention that based on how the student archetypes line up, that will require a certain type of intervention. And I think very generally we've been given the same treatment to all, but I think it'll be useful for programs to really target their time and energy to providing supports based on the challenges that a student exhibits, and then not to be or to be careful about you know, how much time you're spending with certain students to the detriment of other students who may not appear to be as needy. Any final thoughts, Devorah?
I think, again, I'm going to reiterate that we shouldn't be using these groups to identify individual students, but to think more holistically about our whole groups of students. And like much of the work we do, I think it left us with more questions than answers. I certainly was expecting when I went into this analysis to find a number of subgroups in Gateway and to find that we were serving one group better than others, which was not the case, which again leads to more questions about how each of, now that we know we have these subgroups, how do each of these groups really experience Gateway itself? This analysis really focused on what do our students look like when they start with us. So the next question is, how are they experiencing Gateway, and can we identify specific points or barriers that we would have control over within Gateway that we could better work with these students so more of them can persist?
Okay. Want to provide one final opportunity for you to get your questions or comments in. So if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and send those in right now. Okay, well, we definitely want to thank you for joining us today. And again, if you have questions that come up after the fact, feel free to contact Devora or myself, and we'll be glad to address those for you. Looks like we have one question. Oh, excellent. Garo Papazian from Mount Wachusett is asking if we could provide him with a copy of this PowerPoint for him to share at a staff meeting, and we say absolutely. Thank you, Garo. Have a great day. We'll be in touch. All right, well, if there are no more questions, again, we want to thank you, and oh, looks like
now they're coming in.
that's right. We got a thanks a bunch, you bet. And we will make sure that folks on this call get a copy of the PowerPoint. Thank you.
This, I should add to the presentation that was given at the PLC is available on Gateway Live as well.
Okay, and maybe that's, do you think that's more ideal?
It's got a little more detail. We can provide this one as well, but certainly if you search for the Who Are Our Students on Gateway Live, you should come to the link.
Okay.
Where we've got both the PowerPoint and the handout, I believe, from the PLC.
All right. So thank you all, and make it a great day. Bye-bye.